Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to this continuing study on the book of Ephesians. And the last time we met, we went through an introduction, and today we're going to actually go into the text itself. There are 6 chapters to Ephesians. There's just so much to review, so much profundity in the letter to the Ephesians that it'd be very surprised if it didn't blow your mind as it's been blowing mine. I've been studying to bring the material to you. So we're going to take our time and go through this material. And if that means we only get through a few verses of a particular chapter, then we only get through a few verses. Because we're going to look at other things. We're going to do cross comparison and cross verses, etc. And we're really going to come to what I hope will be a much better understanding of the book. I keep saying book. It's really a letter, but out of sheer habit, I'll be probably interchanging book and letter through the course of it. And just understand that's just habit. But it is a letter. It is an epistle, which is a letter that is written to a group. And it was a letter that was written by the Apostle Paul. And I'm not going to go through all the introductory material again. You can always check out the session when it's posted on YouTube. But I want to just go straight to the text today. Before I begin, I always like to give credit where credit is due, because I have a myriad number of teachers when it comes to these things. And many of the things that I'll be speaking with you are things that I've learned for decades of study, but the teachers keep being added. So I want to give special mention to N.T. Wright, as always, for material that I learned from him. And I also want to give really special mention to Tim Mackie, who is the co-founder of the Bible Project that many of you know. Just phenomenal studies, both of them, on the book of Ephesians. And I've gleaned a lot of material from them that helps to better frame the things I've learned over the years and put some flesh around the bones. And just, I really hope that you enjoy the study as much as I've enjoyed learning more and bringing this material out. So with that in mind, we're actually going to look at some of Tim Mackie's study notes today as part of this discussion, because he has some things laid out that I think are extremely beneficial to better understand the letter. And as a matter of fact, we're going to go there right away. I'm going to take you to the notes for his course on Ephesians. And what I'd like to do is use his sentence diagram translation. Sentence diagrams are wonderful things, because sentence diagrams help us to see the structure of a written work. And this is true of anything, not just in biblical material. But it's especially important when you're trying to understand the flow of a biblical book. I have found that it's been extremely useful. One of the things that was impressed upon us when I was studying in my seminary-like environment, which was what we called Obadiah School of the Bible, we were told that one of the first things that you would want to consider when looking at a book is to read the book in its entirety, so that you can get the general flavor and the gist. This is one of the reasons why I like to, and I did this in the introduction, as you recall, I like to go over a chart or two of different people's representations of the overall flow of the book. And people will have, again, their different interpretations, but they're not going to be so far off from one another. They're going to have some nuances of difference, but generally speaking, they're going to be talking about similar things and themes and that kind of thing. But another thing is just reading the book straight through and then coming up with your own outline. And that was something that was impressed upon us. And we would do that. We'd read the entire book. I remember reading the book of Acts and coming out with an outline of the book of Acts. Matter of fact, I went through the book of Acts, and I don't think it was for the entire book, because that would have been monumental. But I think we took 1 or 2 chapters and literally went through the entire chapter or 2, and every word in English, and every word we identified the part of speech that it was. That would be fascinating to do in Greek at some point, if I learn enough Greek to be able to do that. But just in English, it was an amazing exercise, because sometimes the things that you think a word means in a particular sentence doesn't necessarily mean that in that particular context. I'm telling you all this because it's important for us to take a very close look at these books. And when you look at these sentence diagrams, it helps you to do that, because it lays things out in a way that you could see connections between different words and different themes and parallelisms. And if there's chiasms, as I described to you in the past, and things of that nature. So we're going to take a look at his translation of chapter 1. And I want to start not with his translation, but I want to start with just a standard translation. And then we're going to come back and we're going to look at his sentence diagram translation of chapter 1. And then we're going to dive into the translation and talk about it. Before we even go there, though, I want to just move over to his general structure of the book, because I think that this will also be helpful to you. So hopefully in a moment, you will see what he calls the literary design of Ephesians. Can you see that? It says the literary and rhetorical design of Ephesians. Is that what it says on screen? So when you look at Ephesians chapters 1 through 3, and I mentioned this in the introduction, chapters 1 through 3 of the letter are, you might consider that the first half, and then the second half, of course, Ephesians 4 through 6. 1 through 3 concentrate on doctrinal issues, overarching concepts of doctrine and themes and things of that nature. Basically telling you who or what we are in Yahshua. Who or what we are in Yahshua. The second half, which is chapters 4 through 6, explains to you in more practical terms, based upon what you know about who we are and what we are in Messiah, how should we live on the basis of knowing that? How should we live? So if you look at the way that he describes this here, and notice that he has a chiastic structure. And just to reiterate to you that chiasm is a structure in which you have repetition in parallel fashion, and you have an A, B, C, D, where you're talking about specific topics or themes, and then you repeat those things, but going in a different direction. And it's almost like an X type or V or an X, depending on the way that it's done. So if you look at this here, verses 1 through 14 is a victory song to the Father. Now, they hold to a Trinitarian doctrine, so they'll say the Father, Son, and Spirit. So all Father, Son, and Spirit are mentioned here. And in the context, we can debate about the Trinitarian nature, etc. But victory song to the Father, Son, and Spirit, this is the initial A, if you see. So if you look at the other A and you see that little mark, that's an apostrophe, right? That's read A prime. So A prime is the way that this ends. And that's in chapter 3. So chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, doxology song. A doxology is a song glorifying the Father and the Son. So it's a doxology song to the Father, to the Son. So that whole first half starts with a victory song, and it ends with the victory song, a doxology song. Then you have B, chapter 1, verses 15 to 21, which is a prayer. Okay, and this particular prayer is for an apocalypse of power. We're going to cover that when we get to those verses. And then if you look at B prime, 3, 14 to 19, it's a prayer for power to grasp the Messiah's love. So the topic is a little different, the topic of prayer, but it's still a prayer. So the inner part is also B, right? B prime. And then C is in two parts up here. 1 to 10, rescue from death and the ruler of the age. And then 11 to 18, rescue from hostility and alienation from Yahweh's family. Okay. So this is 2, 1 through 18. And then you have the comparable C, which is 3, 1 to 13, the imprisoned apostle of the messianic apocalypse. So there's a connection in terms of this rescue and this imprisonment. And then you have D, which is the center of it all, right? Sort of the hinge upon which everything goes around. And that hinge, which he terms D, is 2:19 to 22, which is the messianic victory monument, the new temple, which is where everything is pointing to from both ends. See that? Again, it's the hinge. It's the center. If we were doing like a key center of this passage, it might be found in that section there, 2:19 to 22, where you're talking about the messianic victory through the new temple. Okay. So I just want you to notice that there's a very definitive structure. Now, again, this is just one man's interpretation of how that works, but it's still a very compelling case that he makes here to show that there's structure to the book of Ephesians. It's not just some haphazard letter that was put together that Paul decided to sit down and write one day, and he just fired off a letter and it was done. This took time to write. This took thought to write. It's too well structured to be coincidental that it should be structured in this way. And the literary structure is something that makes it extremely powerful, as we'll see as we continue to go through it. And then the second half, 4 to 6, there's again a chiastic structure. So A starts out, this is the practical section now. In other words, it starts off in verse 1, therefore. Whenever you see, I've heard several Bible teachers say that whenever you see in the text, therefore, you ask, what is it there for, right? So therefore, what is it there for? In other words, all the things that you saw before that I wrote, as a result of that, this is now what you should be doing and thinking. Therefore, as a result of everything I said from chapters 1 to 3, now we're going to see how we should live because of that. So A, 4:1 to 16, is promoting the unity of the new humanity, which is what the letter to the Ephesians is pointing to. And then A prime is the battle for the unity of the new humanity. So you're promoting the unity and you're battling for that unity. Battling what? Battling those powers of the air and the forces that are going against the ways of Yahweh. And then B, the old versus the new humanity, okay? And then there's two. There's a B prime and a B double prime, B prime prime. So B prime is the dark versus the light. And then the following verses, the foolish versus the wise. In other words, you have the foolish that are following the powers that be in the old world, the old humanity, and then that's versus the wise spirit-influenced humanity, which is moving towards Yahweh's new way of doing things. Again, so you see the structure that is very deliberate and that is very informative and instructive. Okay. So like he said, the letter is designed with two large movements, each with a corresponding introductory and concluding section. And I'm just scratching the surface. I obviously don't have time to go into the kind of depth that he goes into. And if any of you are interested, this is available to anyone. You can go right to the Bible Project site. If you're interested in this, to the classroom section, let me know. Just contact me, and I'll tell you exactly how you can do that. No cost, and you can go through this. It's a 12-hour course. It'll take you some time to go through it, but it's phenomenal. Okay. I'm going to read it in the NASB only because I want text that's going to be more literal right now. And then when we go to his personal translation, which is actually he himself that translated it, then we'll see his nuances that he picks up there, and we'll see the structure that he suggests for it. So let's go to Ephesians chapter 1, and we're going to read through the whole chapter. Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yahshua, by the will of Elohim, to the saints who are at Ephesus and who are faithful in Messiah Yahshua, grace to you and peace from Yahweh our Father and the sovereign Yahshua Messiah. Blessed be the Elohim and Father of our Master Yahshua Messiah, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Messiah, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us to adoption as sons through Yahshua Messiah to himself, according to the kind intention of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, which he freely bestowed on us in the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished on us. In all wisdom and insight, he made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his kind intention, which he purposed in him, with a view to an administration suitable to the fullness of the times, that is, the summing up of all things in Messiah, things in the heavens and things on the earth. In him also we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will, to the end that we who were the first to hope in Messiah would be to the praise of his glory. In him, you also, after listening to the message of truth, the gospel of your salvation, having also believed, you were sealed in him with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is given as a pledge of our inheritance, with a view to the redemption of Yahweh's own possession, to the praise of his glory. For this reason, I too, having heard of the faith in the sovereign Yahshua which exists among you and your love for all the saints, do not cease giving thanks for you, while making mention of you in my prayers, that the Elohim of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah, the Father of glory, may give to you a spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, so that you will know what is the hope of his calling, what are the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the surpassing greatness of his power toward us who believe. These are in accordance with the working of the strength of his might, which he brought about in Messiah, when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things in subjection under his feet, and gave him as head over all things to the assembly, which is his body, to the fullness of him who fills all in all. It's a mouthful. And by the way, the second longest sentence, at least in the original Greek, and depending on whether you think that Greek was original, maybe you might call it the surviving Greek, but in the original Greek of the New Testament, the second longest sentence is Ephesians 1, and let me bring it up here. So this entire paragraph here is in the Greek, this is all one sentence. So I'm really grateful for all these translations and that make some conscious decisions to periods and commas and everything, because otherwise I think we'd be lost in the weeds. So there's definite structure in all of this, and there's a lot that he's packing into all of this. And as you go through here, you're going to see all this language, right? Glory and redemption, trespasses, forgiveness, grace, mystery, administration, fullness, predestined, right? Inheritance, gospel. So many different terms that sometimes are taken for granted, each of which means something very specific to the story. And we're going to try to examine as many of those as we possibly can, because I believe it's going to help us significantly to understand what it is that we're reading. And not only what we're reading here in Ephesians, it's also going to help you to understand things that you see in Romans and Galatians and elsewhere in the scripture. And when you start connecting all the connective tissue by better understanding these words, these terms, I think it's going to open up your eyes to better understand the scriptures in a whole new way. Okay. I know that sounds like a big promise, but I believe that it's fully true. I just hope that I do it justice in explaining it to you. So let's go through this. Let's go to the translation Tim Mackie does here. And then we're going to see some of the structure at play for chapter 1. Okay. So let me bring it up on screen. Okay. This is the sentence diagram for chapter 1. So just glance at this, right? So Paul, obviously, an apostle of Messiah Yahshua through the will of Elohim. So you see the way this is done, right? Paul to the holy ones, grace to, and this is going to be interesting because you're going to see this throughout. Y'all sounds like he's trying to be funny, trying to do a southern accent or something. It's not what it is that he wants to show, because we're so trained at looking at the book as a personal thing to each one of us as an individual. And that's not what's being done here. So you have to look at the language as it exists, or you miss the point of what's being said. Let's go back to, and you know that I already stopped in the first verse. If you think about how we typically read the scriptures, and it says here, grace to you and peace from Elohim the Father, right? So I'm going to add a parallel here. Now I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. This is the Greek version, obviously. And if you look at verse 2, this is the word for grace, right? This is the word that from where we get the word charity. It's a charis, and that's the word for grace. And then this word here, humin, this is the word, you can see it down below. You can see it's you, right? Grace to you, okay? But notice that if you look in the lower left, what does it say? It says it's a pronoun, right? It's you, but it's you, second plural, right? What is the second plural? It's you, multiple you, right? Remember, this is an epistle. He's not writing this letter to an individual. He's not writing it to Timothy or something like that specifically, right? He's writing this letter to a group. So this grace to you, he's addressing a broader group. And that's exactly what the Greek says, right? Who means second plural, you people. Everywhere pretty much that you see that, okay? So here is us in verse 5. Us is what? It's plural, we, right? In the lower left. So we're talking about a group here. And you're going to see over and over again, wherever he talks about you, look on the lower left, you people, right? Why am I making such a big deal out of this? Okay, so it's you people. Because when people look at this, how many people can remember a time when they look at chapter 1 of Ephesians, and you have this concept of predestined, right? And you look at other places like in Romans where it talks about predestination. And we're all trying to figure out what exactly that means. We think of predestined in a certain term, in a certain way. Predestined means that it's your destiny to go in a certain direction. We look at the word predestined and we think about the personal application to us as individuals, and we think about it as, am I predestined to be saved? Or am I predestined to be lost? Am I predestined to be in the kingdom? Or am I predestined to be sent into the fires of Gehenna, so to speak, right? And that's absolutely not what Paul is talking about. This is not a personal message to each of us talking about our individual predestination for salvation. This is a very specific story that is unfolding here that, like everything else in the scriptures, both in the Gospels and in Paul's writings, are references to the entire biblical story. Do you remember when we did the study on the new humanity? And we talked about the concentric circles and how everything, like when you throw a stone in a pond and it hits in the middle, but then there are ripple effects to take it outward. And that's how the biblical story goes. It doesn't start with Yahshua the Messiah. Yahshua is the culmination of ripple after ripple, beginning in the Garden of Eden, and then moving its way outward towards Abraham, and then towards Israel, and then ultimately until you get to Yahshua himself. And everything culminates in the entire humanity, essentially. It actually starts with Adam and Eve, who represent humanity. So when you look at so much of what's written in the scriptures, the way that oftentimes the glasses, if you're thinking about reading the scriptures with glasses, like a decoder, people take the decoder that the traditional decoder is that the Bible, and particularly the New Testament, is talking about individual salvation. There's some of that for sure, to be sure. But most of the major texts that are written that are used to proof text that are not speaking at all about individual salvation. They're talking about how the entire biblical story has unfolded. What is that entire biblical story? It is the salvation of humankind. It is the reversal of what happened in the Garden of Eden that almost destroyed mankind's hope to have intimate connection with Almighty Yahweh. So the record of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation is to somehow bring mankind through repentance back to Almighty Yahweh so that heaven and earth can be reunited, so that Almighty Yahweh and humankind can live together in peace and intimacy forever. That's the biblical story. And that sounds lofty, and it is. But it's important to understand that so that when we're looking at these things, we must understand the context in which that is being written. Okay? So I'm taking a lot of time to lay this foundation because I think it's important that as we start seeing these terms and reading them and looking at different verses, we're talking about an explanation of the entire biblical story, and it changes everything. Because now you take off those glasses that says it's all about me, and you take the other glasses, which is what I believe is the more accurate glasses, and you put those on, and all of a sudden the vista opens with clarity. Because now you see the story about us. You see the story about the whole humanity. You see the story not about little sin in Romans. You see it about sin with a capital S that affects the entirety of humanity. And this will become clearer, I think, as we go through here. Okay? When you consider that, and I'll just give you a little preview, that the predestination and the election, the chosenness, if you will, that's being described in the first chapter of Ephesians, when you consider that's not talking about your individual chosenness or predestination, election, but it's talking about the story of the Bible, which is talking about Israel, the nation Israel, Abraham and his descendants. It changes the way you understand the story, because all of that initial story leads to later in the chapter when he's talking about you, who is now the Gentiles who are part of Ephesus. Because what's happening is that Paul is trying to show that we who first believed, who were the ones who first believed? It was Israel. We who first believed, etc., etc., etc. We who were adopted as sons. Who was adopted as sons? Israel. We who were supposed to carry out the story, we were the first ones, but now you Gentiles are also part of that. And it goes on to explain that even further in chapter 2, which we have read many times, where it says, you who are far off now can be brought near into the commonwealth of Israel, is what the implication is. So I just want you to unlearn some of the things that you have learned in the past, or at least keep your mind open so that you can see what allowing the proper set of glasses to be put on, how that's going to affect your thinking about these things. Okay? All right. So let's go back to the structure of the text. He says, Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yahshua, through the will of Yahweh. To who? To the holy ones who are in Ephesus. And I'm going to go back verse by verse. So I'm just looking at the structure now. Who are in Ephesus. Notice that are in Ephesus is in parentheses, in brackets. And that's because of what I mentioned last time, that in at least 3 of the main older ancient versions, that does not appear. Also are believing in Messiah Yahshua. Grace to y'all. So when you see y'all, it's talking about you plural, right? Grace to y'all and peace from Yahweh our Father and the sovereign Yahshua Messiah. And then he continues in verse 3, new thought, right? These are different, what he calls movements. So here, blessed be the Elohim and Father of our Master Yahshua Messiah, who has blessed us. What has he blessed us with? With every blessing of the Spirit in the heavens through the Messiah, because he chose us. Okay, he blessed us. Who did he bless? Israel, because he chose us. Who did he choose? Israel. In him, before, and notice the in him, because you're going to see that over and over again. When in him? When did he choose us? Before the foundation of the cosmos, so that we would be holy and blameless before him, which is what Israel was supposed to be, as an example, as a witness. In love, having predestined us. Predestined who? Israel. For adoption/sonship. Who was adopted and made a son? Israel. How? Through Yahshua Messiah unto himself, in accordance with the purpose of his will, resulting in praise for the glory of his grace. And just notice the terms, glory, etc. Okay. Now, which he graced us. Who did he grace? Israel. In the beloved one. In whom, in who? Yahshua. In him, through him, in whom we have redemption. What is redemption? We'll talk about it. How did the redemption come to pass? Through his blood. For what purpose? The forgiveness of sins, according to the richness of his grace, which he made abundant for us. Who us? Israel. With all wisdom and understanding, having made known to us the open secret of his will in accordance with his purpose. And this open secret is where you typically see the word mystery. We'll talk about it. Which he pre-planned in him. There it is again. For what purpose? For the purpose of arranging the fullness of the times. Fullness. What is fullness? We'll talk about it. To head up all things together in Messiah. Things in the heavens and things in earth. In him. In whom also we have obtained an inheritance. We who? We, Israel. Having been predestined in accordance with the plan of the one who works all things according to the decision of his will, so that we who, Israel, would praise his glory. We who were the first ones to hope in the Messiah. Who were the first ones to hope in the Messiah? Israel. In whom, there it is again, also y'all who? All of them. Jew and Gentile. But perhaps more directly in this particular case, because of the context, y'all the Gentiles, the nations, having heard the word of truth, the good news of y'all's salvation, in whom also, having believed, y'all were sealed. Who's y'all? The Gentiles, the nations, were sealed by the promised Holy Spirit, who is the first installment of our inheritance for the redemption of the possession, resulting in the praise of his glory. Same result as up here for Israel, right? You sealed by the promised Holy Spirit for the redemption of the possession, resulting in the same thing, in the praise of his glory. So both through Israel and through the Gentiles, Yahweh's glory is being praised. Okay? For this reason, as I heard of y'all's faith in the Master Yahshua, y'all who? All of them. And the love which is toward all of the holy ones, I have not stopped giving thanks, making remembrance on y'all's behalf in my prayers, in order that the Elohim of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah, the Father of glory, would give y'all a spirit of wisdom and revelation in order to know him. So I'm going to stop saying y'all and I'm going to start saying you, with the understanding that you, every time I mention it, is going to be plural, okay? Would give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation in order to know him, in the eyes of your heart having been illuminated, so that you would know what does he want you to know? What is the hope of his calling? What is the richness of the glory? What glory? Of his inheritance among the holy ones. And third thing, what is the surpassing greatness of his power toward you who trust, in accordance with the working of the power of his might, which he worked in the Messiah, having raised him from the dead ones and having seated him at his right hand. I know this is a lot that's flying by you right now. Please don't worry, because we're going to go over all of this in great detail, okay? And he seated him where? In the heavenly realm, above all rule and authority and power and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the coming one. Does this look familiar at all? Someone in the heavenly realm seated at the right hand of Yahweh, ruling over every power and authority? It should look familiar, because I've been hammering on this for the last year. This is Daniel language, right? This is fulfillment of Daniel 7, amongst other places. And he placed all things under his feet and gave him headship over all things in the assembly, which is his body, the fullness of the one who fills all in all. So let me give you a little preview. This language of fullness, who fills all in all, what is that? It's temple language, right? What is it that fills? It's the Spirit of Yahweh that fills the temple. What is it that we're moving towards? We're moving towards the centrality of all of this, which is the temple. Okay? We've seen that many times in the past, and we'll get to it, but it talks about us being built up as a temple. Remember that? This is chapter 2. There's a quick preview. Therefore, then, verse 19, you are no longer foreigners and immigrants, the Gentiles, right? Y'all, the Gentiles. But you are fellow citizens with the holy ones. What holy ones? Israel. And members of Yahweh's household family. What members of Yahweh's household family? Israel. Having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So all of you together, having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, the cornerstone being Messiah Yahshua himself, in whom the entire building, Jew and Gentile, is joined together, right? He starts this chapter talking about the reconciliation, so that there is no more distinction between the two. And I don't want to get too far astray here, but at one point you were not part of this, and now you are part of it. For what purpose? So that the entire building can be joined together on that foundation of the apostles and prophets, with the cornerstone itself being Messiah Yahshua. For what purpose? So that it can grow into a holy temple in Yahweh, in whom you too are being built together into a dwelling building of Yahweh by means of the Spirit. So when we go back here to chapter 1, and we see that we're talking about something being filled with the fullness of Elohim, which is his body, verse 23, the fullness of the one who fills all in all. We're talking about Yahweh filling that temple. It's temple language, as is glory, temple language. And other things are associated, like grace, etc. The purpose of sacrifices was to extend Yahweh's grace. Not how we could go. But I just want you to see that beautiful structure that exists here, and that is so beautifully laid out by Tim Mackie here. Let's go back to the text, and we'll start taking some of these little by little, okay? Ephesians 1 the entirety of the chapter is really a long, extended period of worship and prayer on Paul's part. Okay, because you already saw that the last several verses are prayer, but it's an act of worship, is what Paul is going through as he describes what Yahweh has done by means of his people for all of mankind, because all of mankind is being included in this. So chapter 1 starts off talking about the history with Israel, but it continues through Yahshua in him. It shows how we're all brought together, that it didn't end with physical Israel, right? It extended to the Gentiles as well. And we were all brought together as we come together to build the one building, the one temple for the honor and glory and praise of Yahweh, so he could fill the entire earth. This is what the prophets talked about, yes? That the glory of Yahweh would fill the earth, and I forget the exact expression. It's like the waters cover the seas. You ever think about that? The waters cover the seas? What does that mean? We're talking about something poetic here. It's not a literal thing, right? It's describing Yahweh enveloping the entire earth with his glory. So in Ephesians 1:1, so Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yahshua, by the will of Yahweh. So an apostle is someone who's sent out, and Paul is in fact called an apostle. Paul met the conditions to be called an apostle because he saw the Messiah. He didn't walk with him as the others walked with him, but he still walked with him in the unique mission in which he was given. So Paul is considered an apostle of Messiah Yahshua by the will of Yahweh. And this term Messiah means an anointed one, and what it is, in effect, is describing kingship, right? So an apostle of King Yahshua, if you will, by the will of Elohim. Now, it doesn't always mean that, because it depends on the context. If it's talking about a priest could also be anointed, in which case you wouldn't call a priest a king. But in the context of Messiah Yahshua here, okay, you're talking about one who is the promised future ruler, the promised future king, by the will of Elohim, by the will of Yahweh. An apostle is an emissary. It's someone who's sent out, like an ambassador, right? But it's a person who has a particular mission, who is sent out to fulfill that mission. And we all know that Paul was sent out specifically to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, it doesn't mean he didn't interact with the Jewish people. Obviously, he did. And we see that all throughout the scriptures in the book of Acts and throughout his letters. But his unique contribution to the promotion of the gospel was as an emissary to the nations. And he was very well equipped to do that, because he had been a Pharisee, which is one of the stricter sects in Judaism, and he had been very strict and zealous in terms of keeping the ways of his people. And because he was well respected, and because he knew of what he spoke, he became a very credible, once people began to trust him, of course, he became a very important co-worker to the early assembly, and particularly to the leaders in Jerusalem, because he would have credibility. No one could ever say that this person who was going to the Gentiles was lax in his observance of the Torah. No one could ever say that he didn't understand the uniqueness of the mission, the Jewish people, etc., because he was a Jew. And because not only was he a Jew, but he was a Jew of the strictest sect who was observant in everything. So for him to go and be the one to reach out to the Gentiles was a pretty big deal. For some people, it meant that they totally vilified him, because how dare you talk to these dirty Gentiles? And to other people, it was like, oh, wow, if Paul, being who he was, will reach out to the Gentiles, then it must be okay for me to reach out to the Gentiles. And the whole thing was to get Jew and Gentile together, in the same way that the whole purpose of the temple is to get heaven and earth together, right? So he writes this to the saints who are at Ephesus. The word hagios is a word that means, it's literally a holy one, or it's plural, holy ones, right? To the holy ones who are at Ephesus and who are faithful in Messiah Yahshua. So these are those who are consecrated to Yahweh, right? This term doesn't have anything to do with little statues, right? It's a later derivation that people began to call the saints and the idols and all that. But even within the Catholic Church and others, the people were called saints, right? So you'll see people talking about sainthood and that kind of thing. But we're not talking about that in that sense, right? I've never been comfortable with things like St. Paul or St. John. I get that. I get the tendency to want to do that, but I don't agree with it. You notice that Paul never he wouldn't even refer to himself with a title like elder, right? It wasn't Elder Paul, it was Paul. So am I saying the titles are wrong? No, it's just, are they necessary? That's a debate for another day. But this is just a generic term that is still it's a generic term, so it's not meant to be used as a title, but it is more than just a generic term, right? It's a term of art that means someone who is fully dedicated and consecrated to Almighty Yahweh. And these saints who are at Ephesus, and I mentioned how this was probably a cyclical letter that was going to go around, but it could have been to Ephesus because the early church fathers, there are witnesses that they called it to the Ephesians. So we're going to say it's to the Ephesians, and it was probably read to all the different people in the area. To the saints who are at Ephesus and who are faithful in Messiah Yahshua. And this term, faithful, pistois in this context, it means, look down below, it means faithful, reliable, trustworthy, stable. So you're going to see the word faith used, some version of this word used, and there's some debate depending on the context. Does it mean faithful in terms of what you believe, right? The faith, not so much faithful, but the term faith. You're going to see it over and over. And is it faith in terms of the belief system itself, or is it faith in terms of you're holding good faith, that you're loyal? It's probably a little of both, right? But depending on the context, it might be referring to the actual belief itself. And depending on how it's used, it might be talking about the act of loyalty, the state of being loyal to Yahweh. So here, this term obviously is a verb, right? They're being faithful in Messiah Yahshua. They're being dedicated, trustworthy, stable, reliable in Him. Grace to you and peace from Yahweh our Father and the sovereign Yahshua Messiah. This term grace, it means very specific things, right? It means the unmerited, undeserved kindness of Almighty Yahweh. And it's the kind of thing that you would hope for. So if there was a transgression, you would hope for the grace of the person who you wronged. So if you think about the kind of relief that you feel when someone acts graciously to you, right? When you've done something that you know was wrong, and yet that person extends forgiveness, that's an act of grace. Or if the person had an expectation of you and you failed in your meeting of that expectation, and that person was willing to bypass that failure, that's an act of grace. So we're going to come back to grace when appropriate. But the bottom line is that grace is that I'm a superior to you, and yet I look beyond the surface, and I allow you to, I don't know how to say it without saying grace. You understand what I'm saying? That I bypass, I'm willing to overlook something that you did wrong, or you're not meeting the standard, even though I have every right, put it that way, even though I have every right to hold you accountable, I am not holding you accountable to the extent that I know that I have the right to do. And that's an important concept that's going to have connotations to how we are supposed to be with others. And not only grace, but also peace, right? The peace that comes from Yahweh, which Yahshua described it as a peace that's different than the kind of peace that the world gives. And obviously, there's not peace being the absence of war or the absence of strife or conflict. This is shalom, right? The word shalom means integrity, wholeness. It means that you are in the condition of wholeness. If someone says to you, shalom aleichem, peace to you, the idea is that you are being blessed with a whole life, and everything is as it should be. And it's not divided in terms of bad and the good. It's all good, right? From Elohim, our Father, and the Master Yahshua Messiah. So this is just a standard greeting that you would see in Paul's letters. And then verse 3 begins this long sentence that is so packed with meaning. So he says, blessed be the Elohim and Father of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Messiah. And then this spiritual blessing, this idea of a spiritual blessing, we always have to be careful how we understand the term spiritual as used in the New Testament, because sometimes people, they spiritualize something spiritual, okay? And everything becomes a spiritual this and a spiritual that. And what this is talking about is the nature of the blessing, the source of the blessing. The source of the blessing is from the Spirit, okay? So he has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Messiah, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. So you heard me emphasizing before this concept of in him, right? And the reason that I keep emphasizing is that, first of all, there's nothing that we do that's in and of ourselves, right? Everything that we do, everything that we have is because of him, because he is the intercessor, right? Whatever hope we have for the future is in him. And whatever we accomplish is in him. That's why a legalistic religion, a legalistic way of living and of doctrine is not a biblical way of operating, because there is nothing that we could do in and of our own strength that would somehow make us worthy of the Father. You can't keep enough Sabbaths to be worthy of the Father's love. You can't keep enough holy days. You can't tithe enough to keep the Father's love, right? Because it's not about the things that you do for him. It's what you are in Yahshua. In other words, through faith in Yahshua the Messiah, you'll have that intimate connection with Almighty Yahweh because of what Yahshua has done. And you see this very clearly in the book of Romans. Because of the faith of Yahshua, it's not our faith in Yahshua, it's faith of Yahshua. It's the faith in what he has done. It is Yahshua's faith that makes us who we are. In other words, whatever Yahshua accomplished, whatever he is, we now also are in him. Because of what he has done, we are that in him. Now, this has nothing to do with, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be keeping the Sabbath and dietary laws and holy days and all that. That's a different argument and a different thing to talk about altogether. That we would be in the discussion dealing with sanctification. But what I'm saying is that in terms of our salvation, there is nothing that we can do. There is no laundry list that we can keep where we could say that we are saved outside of Yahshua the Messiah. Because we can never keep the Torah perfectly enough, first of all, to be able to do that. And as soon as we broke the law once, we'd be done for, because the one who breaks the commandments doesn't live. So the only way that we are allowed to continue is because an innocent took our place, and because of his substitutionary sacrifice, in which through his blood we are covered. And then we could always go, and if we had time, we could look at the sacrificial laws in the Torah, and you could see how all that works. And we have done some of that before. But the bottom line is that the only reason that we are able to move forward and have life and have an opportunity for life in the coming age is in him. So it says, he blessed us with every, and remember that this us is going to be referring in these initial verses to Israel because of the context. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. We're going to look at some reasons why I say that. But he's blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Messiah, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. So when you see this term blessing, you see this over and over again. Blessed be the Elohim Father, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing. It's over and over. And when you look at that term blessing, he's starting all the way back in Genesis. Because where was mankind originally blessed? They were blessed in Genesis. So let's take a look at that. And he creates man. And what does he say to man? He says in Genesis 1:26. So it says he made man, and that was man and male and female. And then it says in verse 28, Elohim blessed them. So when you're looking at terms in the New Testament, you have to make a comparison in the context in which it's given. So Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So he told them to do what? To be fruitful and multiply, and to fill the earth. So it's interesting because we're talking about the language of filling later, right? So he's having them fill the earth, and that's not coincidental. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it and rule. He's talking about blessing and filling and rulership, all themes that are touched upon throughout the book of Ephesians, but starting in chapter 1. Okay? And he's going to be talking about some of this other stuff as we go through it. But he says that he wants them to go and do all these things because he is putting them in there in that garden for the purpose of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth and subduing it. But what happens with that charge as time goes along? They do fill the earth, but what is it that they fill the earth with? Genesis 6, verse 5. Then Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then he says here, a little bit further down in Genesis 6:11, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of Elohim, and the earth was filled with violence. Elohim looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. So he was filling the earth, but he was filling it with violence. So, of course, we know about the flood, and then Noah was really the only one that was found to be not corrupted. And then after the flood, what happens with Noah? Noah also fails, right? Adam and Eve begin, and we all know the story. They fail in their charge, and then their descendants, etc., continue that failure until the point where Yahweh says, I'm going to start again. And he uses Noah as the conduit to be able to do that. And then he makes a covenant with Noah, okay? And what happens in 9 verse 1? And Elohim blessed Noah. There it is again. And he blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So now Noah is the new Adam, right? So he and his family are supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So we're starting fresh, right? And he makes sure that violence doesn't overtake things again, right? So he says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of Elohim he made man. In other words, these are the reasons why you don't have violence, right? And this is the aversion that I have to violence. And this is what's going to be the consequence. For in the image of Elohim he made man. It's not supposed to be that way. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. And then, of course, we know that immediately Noah, we see weakness in Noah, and he fails. And then by the time we get to Genesis 11, the whole earth used the same language and the same words, and they're trying to bring everything together, right? They're supposed to fill the earth and populate it, which means that they're supposed to spread throughout the entire earth. And instead, what do? They concentrate everything to themselves because they're trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to build a utopia on their own merits with their own strength and their own power, not according to the way that Yahweh had planned it. Yahweh had said to them, go out, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with his holiness, essentially. And instead, corruption sets in and they do the opposite. And they bring everybody in, but not for good. And then Yahweh himself winds up scattering them because they're not supposed to be concentrated in the city like that up to something that is going to be contrary to his will. So he disperses them and he sends them out into different directions, different languages. And then in the very next chapter, what does he do? He starts again. Only this time he does it to one family, right? And that's through Abram. And he says, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house, is Genesis 12, verse 1, to the land which I will show you. And I'm taking a lot of time to do this because it's the story. And he says, I will make you a great nation. And I will what? I will bless you. There it is again. And make your name great. In other words, the very thing that everybody else was trying to do for themselves, because they said back in Genesis 11, what is it that they actually said? They said, verse 4, they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. In other words, you're going to invade Yahweh's space, so to speak, thinking that you can presume to do that. And let us make for ourselves, notice how many times it says that, right? Ourselves, a name. They're going to make a name for themselves. Instead of honoring Yahweh's name, instead of giving glory to his name, they're going to make for the name for themselves. I won't go back to it at the moment, but when we were looking in Ephesians, what does it talk about for both Jew and Gentile? That they're doing all these things, what? For the praise of his name, right? We saw that. And these folks are praising their own name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Yeah. You're supposed to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth, spreading Yahweh's fame and his name and his glory throughout the entire earth. So when we get to Genesis 12, Yahweh chooses a righteous man, another Noah, right? Presumably another Adam, so to speak, to go out. And he says, I will make you a great nation and I will bless you. So each one of them was promised blessing and make your name great. Yahweh will make your name great. You don't make your own name great. And so get this, you, Abraham, you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And the one who cursed you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. The rest of the scriptures is the record of this taking place. But even that doesn't quite happen, right? We'll get to that in a second. But notice this, and in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So it's one family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who becomes Israel. These were supposed to be the ones who led the charge, the witness, if you will, to the new Adam, so to speak, trying to restore for new creation, in essence. Just like Yahweh did a new creation through Noah, so to speak, right? And now he's doing a new creation. The intention is through Israel to promote new creation. So all the story of getting back to Eden. But did Israel succeed? They did not, right? Because in the course of time, as we know the biblical record quite well, and by the way, through them, all the world would be blessed. All the nations would be blessed. You see it right here. But alas, they failed, right? Sometimes they were better than others, but they did not fulfill what they were needing to fulfill. So eventually, Yahweh takes matters into his own hands, right? And by the way, let me show you one more thing here. Deuteronomy 4. And of course, this is after the Exodus. This is Moses in a sermon. Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which Yahweh your Elohim, the Elohim of your fathers, is giving you. Don't add to the word, don't take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh, etc. And then a little bit further down, he says what? See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding. Notice that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has an Elohim so near to it as is Yahweh our Elohim whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today? This is election. This is chosenness here. And they had responsibilities. And if we keep reading, we see the specific types of responsibilities. So watch yourselves carefully, right? Indeed, ask now concerning the former days which were before you, since the day that Elohim created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of Elohim speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard it and survived? And he keeps on explaining how they were special, right? Out of the heavens, he let you hear his voice to discipline you. And on earth, he let you see his great fire, and you hear his words from the midst of the fire. Because he loved your fathers, Therefore, he chose their descendants after them. That's chosenness, right? And he personally brought you from Egypt by his great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. This is the whole concept of chosenness that's being brought out here. Okay. But the idea is that they're chosen to go out and be an example and a witness for the nations. And you see this clearly in the book of Romans, and you see it in Deuteronomy and other passages of Deuteronomy. We'll look at some of those later. But they didn't fulfill that to its fullest potential. In fact, in the course of due time, whether it was the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, because they had a divide amongst themselves, that notice that the whole biblical record is a record of mankind. Instead of filling the earth with Yahweh's glory, they filled it instead with violence and with destruction. And instead of unity of the people and unity of nations together with them, it's constant division. From the very beginning, there's divisiveness, there's hatred, right? Cain and Abel, and all the different stories, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers. And we can go on, and David and his siblings, and David's children and their siblings, and Absalom and contrary to David, and civil war that leads to north and south of Israel, and on and on. It's that divisiveness instead of the unity that they should have under Yahweh, right? So the biblical record is one of divisiveness and filling the earth with violence. And instead, what Yahweh winds up doing is he winds up taking matters into his own hands, because he sees that the people that he's sent to fulfill his vision for the earth are not doing it, right? So if you look at a place like Isaiah 59, verse 9, and this is shortly before the Babylonian exile, he says, therefore, justice is far from us, and righteousness does not overtake us. In other words, righteousness doesn't overtake us. We wish that righteousness would overtake us, but it doesn't. We hope for light, but behold darkness. For brightness, but we walk in gloom. It's been the day of humanity for as long as we can all remember. We grope along the wall like blind men. We grope like those who have no eyes. We stumble at midday as in the twilight. Among those who are vigorous, we're like dead men. We're like walking dead people. All of us growl like bears. We become like animals, right? And moan sadly like doves. The doves are the peacemakers, and the peacemakers are the ones that are under the oppression all the time, right? So they moan sadly. They moan because of their sad state, because they're always under pressure and violence and lack of justice. We hope for justice, but there is none. For salvation, but it is far from us. For our transgressions are multiplied before you, and our sins testify against us. For our transgressions are with us, and we know our iniquities. They abound, right? Transgressing and denying Yahweh and turning away from our Elohim, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving in and uttering from the heart lying words. It's so bad that justice won't even stick around, right? Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. Righteousness wants nothing to do with us. Righteousness won't even come in the same vicinity because it's so bad. For truth has stumbled in the street. Truth is supposed to be a steady, reliable, trustworthy thing. Even truth is stumbling in the streets because there's so much confusion and so much lack of desire for the truth. And uprightness cannot enter. This is very vivid poetry, right? Yes, truth is lacking. And he who turns aside from evil makes himself a prey. So even if you want to turn away from evil, even if you want to do what's right, you make yourself a prey because people hate the one who wants to do what's right. So now you've become a prey to the rest of the world because you're trying to do what's right. Like I said, this is very much descriptive of our times. Now Yahweh saw, and it was displeasing in his sight that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. Right? He had to take matters into his own hands. And you see this all throughout the book of Isaiah. In chapter 52, where it talks about the good news, and in chapter 53, where it talks about the righteous servant, the suffering servant. But here it's all brought together. He was astonished And he decided, because there was no one who would do this. And historically, right? Noah didn't do it. Abraham didn't do it. David even didn't do it, right? Because David also exhibited weakness. No man could do this. So Yahweh says, I'm going to do it myself. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. And then it describes how that happened. And we're going to see this language in Ephesians later, right? He put on righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. So you think about Ephesians chapter 6. This is what we're talking about, right? Garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself with zeal as a mantle. So we'll probably come back to this, Yahweh willing, when we get to Ephesians 6. And according to their deeds, so he will repay wrath to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the coastlands he will make recompense. So they will fear the name of Yahweh from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of Yahweh drives. A redeemer will come to Zion, and to those who turn from transgression in Jacob, declares Yahweh. So all of this is a description of the story, right? Humanity fails. The remedy fails, which is going through Abraham, right? So Yahweh eventually takes matters into his own hands, and instead he gives the anointed king. So in Genesis 12:3, Yahweh had told Abraham that in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And it's true. Yahweh didn't lie. In you, Abraham. But it would happen through his descendants, right? Who was the ultimate descendant from Abraham? It was Yahshua the Messiah. This is why I say when you look at something like Isaiah 53, I used to get frustrated because I would say, the Jewish people say that Isaiah 53 is talking about Israel. And I would say, no, because the pronouns, talking about an individual and not a group and all that. And then eventually I understood, no, it is talking about Israel. Just not in the way that people describe it. It starts off talking about Israel in general, but this is the issue, right? Israel could not or did not fulfill that charge that Yahweh had given them, that election, the consequences of that chosenness in that election. They were not able to fulfill it. So he sent a representative of Israel, one who represents all of Israel, and that's Yahshua the Messiah. And in you, Abraham, all the nations, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So in you has become in him, right? In him, in Yahshua, in him is the fulfillment of all of this. And because of him, in him, the promises of Genesis 12:3 are being fulfilled as we speak. Because in him, Israel comes in. In him, the nations come in. All the nations, all the families of the earth are blessed in him. Look at Psalm 72, and we'll drop down to verse 17. This entire psalm is a messianic psalm. This is not in the Bible. This is a title that the translators have added. But notice that the translators added the title for this, the reign of the righteous king. It's a messianic psalm. So down in 72, verse 17, what does it say? It says, may his name endure forever. May his name increase as long as the sun shines, and let men bless themselves by him. Let all nations call him blessed. So notice that. May his name endure forever, right? He told Abraham, I'm going to make you a great name. May his name endure forever. May his name increase as long as the sun shines. In other words, forever, right? And let men, here it is, bless themselves by him. In you, all nations will be blessed. Let all nations call him blessed. So when you see language like blessing in Ephesians, it's not coming out of a vacuum, right? It's just, it's not, oh, this, well, bless you. Like we say casually in our culture, oh, bless you. Or even may you be blessed. That's wonderful. That's nice. But there's context behind that language. And it goes all the way back to Genesis, where Yahweh blessed humanity and said, be fruitful and multiply. Continue reading just a little bit here in Psalm 72. Blessed be Yahweh Elohim, the Elohim of Israel, who alone works wonders, and blessed be his glorious name forever. And notice, may the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. And this is what we're talking about in the book of Ephesians. We're talking about these promises being fulfilled so that the whole earth can be filled with his glory. So when you see filling language, it's purposeful, Okay, this filling language of the temple, being filled by the Spirit of Yahweh. It says in Exodus that when Moses put up the tabernacle in Exodus 40, it says that it was hard for him even to go in, right? This is Exodus 40, verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up, then the sons of Israel was set out. But the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And this is representative of what Yahweh wants, right? It's filling the tabernacle, which was what? The tabernacle and then later the temple are representations, models, if you will, of a reunited heaven and earth. So it's heaven and earth reunited, Yahweh's presence with his people. When you visited the temple in ancient times, you were visiting the courtyard of Almighty Yahweh. You were visiting heaven, if you will, in the temple, in the tabernacle. That was the connection. It was Yahweh coming to us in a space that's representative of his space. It's our spaces coming together, if you will, and him filling the entire space. The tabernacle and the temple are meant to show the pattern of how Yahweh intends to unite heaven and earth so that those two, that bifurcated reality becomes one, right? I mentioned that when Yahshua was resurrected, he was able to go freely between those two realities, right? Because they're one and the same. It's just two parts of the same reality. Yeah, I don't want to get too metaphysical here, but the point is that the intention is for us to be united with Almighty Yahweh, for him to live with us. So we're going to go back to Ephesians and read a little bit more, and then we'll look at a few more verses. Okay, so verse 3 we read, right? Blessed be the Elohim of our and Father of our Master Yahshua Messiah, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, a la Genesis, right? Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. So this concept of choosing us before the foundation of the world indicates that there's always been a plan, right? So before the foundation of the world, this brings up something like Colossians 1, where it says, verse 15, he is the image, Yahshua. He is the image of the invisible Elohim, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. And this is language that we see also in Ephesians, in the first chapter. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And this was his purpose. And you see that in verse 10 of chapter 1 of Ephesians. His purpose is to bring all things together. He is also head, kephale, of the body, the assembly, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place, in other words, prominence in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. That's temple language again, right? All the fullness to dwell in him, and through him, right? You see it all over, in him, through him, by him, for him, and through him. And by the way, the entire Bible points to him. And through him to reconcile all things to himself. Notice that. Through him to reconcile all things to himself, including human beings, right? This is why it's such a central theme of Ephesians, is bringing Jew and Gentile together. He's reconciling all things to himself, having made peace. What does he offer them in the very beginning? Even in the greeting, grace and peace to you, right? Having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And here, just like in Ephesians, and although you, Gentiles, although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you, right? He's been reconciling in verse 20 all things. Yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, to his execution, right? In order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach. Who presents things before Yahweh holy and blameless and beyond reproach? The priests, right? What is Yahshua? He is our high priest. doing it. And where does he do it? At the temple. If indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you heard, etc. So we could go parallel passages, point by point, from Colossians to Ephesians. Okay? But the point I wanted to make here, and we'll come back to Colossians as we need to, is that he made all things, right? And then when we go to Proverbs 8, you see that wisdom is personified, right? And notice how wisdom plays into all this. We saw in Psalm 72, or is it in Deuteronomy, about wisdom, in Deuteronomy, wisdom and understanding, right? And wisdom associated with the Spirit of Yahweh all over the place, Isaiah 11 and other places. Wisdom is personified, but in the second part of Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks. And wisdom says this, wisdom in verse 22 of chapter 8 of Proverbs says, Yahweh possessed me, wisdom, at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. In other words, pre-foundation, right? Pre-earth, before the foundation of the earth, before his works of old, from everlasting I was established. Remember I explained to you in John chapter 1 how Yahshua already existed in a pre-existent form? He doesn't, enarche was the word, in the beginning was the word. And that word was not, enarche was not here in the middle, it was at the very beginning. Right? From the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth, when there were no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. And then he goes on describing how before this was, before the mountains, before the waters, etc. When he set for the sea its boundary, etc. Verse 30, then I was beside him. Let me just read 29. When he set for the sea its boundary so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. Should it be any surprise that he became as the son of man? Because he delighted in the sons of men and wanted mankind to be saved and not to die without him? No coincidence, right? Now therefore, O sons, listen to me, wisdom. I who was there from the beginning, listen to me, for blessed, there's a surprise, blessed are they who keep my ways, heed instruction and be wise. You can see in chapter 1 that Paul wants them to be wise. He wants us to be wise, all of us, and do not neglect it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts, etc. Okay? Go back to Ephesians. Just as he chose us, verse 4, in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. Holy and blameless are temple language, right? The sacrificial language. You have to be holy in order to be accepted as a sacrifice. You have to be blameless, the spotless, right? Look at the bottom. This term here means blameless or spotless. The sacrifice could not be blemished, right? This is temple language, that we would be holy. He chose us that we would be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us to adoption as sons through Yahshua Messiah to himself, according to the kind intention of his will. This predestined is related to the chosenness, is related to the adoption, okay? Let's look at a few verses here. Romans 9. I want to show you one even before then. Exodus 4:21. Yahweh said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Right? Israel is his son, is his adopted son. Okay? You might also look at Hosea 11:1 in the prophets. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Right? And that's, as a matter of fact, that's quoted in the Gospels. Okay. Let's go to Romans 9, verse 4. Paul is talking about physical Israel in this passage. And he says in verse 3, for I could wish that I myself were accursed, separated from Messiah for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. But we know he's talking about physical Israel, who are Israelites, to whom belongs what? The adoption as sons and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the temple service and the promises, whose are the fathers, and from whom is the Messiah, according to the flesh, who is over all, Elohim blessed forever. Amen. And then look at verses 6 to 13. So this is adoption, right? Verse 6, but it is not as though the word of Yahweh has failed. Right? His purpose is still being fulfilled. For they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants. But through Isaac your descendants will be named. That is, not the children of the flesh who are children of Elohim, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is the word of promise, at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, and had not yet done anything good or bad, so that Yahweh's purpose, according to his choice, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So here's again, choice, election that's being described here, okay? But it's also hinting at others being brought in, right? Because it's not just all who are descendants from Israel, but the original election and calling, of which Paul speaks about in the first verses of Ephesians, are referring to physical Israel. And then you also look at Romans 11, verse 2. Elohim has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. That foreknew is, again, that predestined, to know ahead of time, to choose ahead of time. 11, verse 5. In the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to Yahweh's gracious choice. Again, we're talking about choice and election. Israel had been chosen as the vehicle of his covenant blessing. Let's look at Romans 8, 28. And we know that Yahweh causes all things to work together for good to those who love Elohim, to those who are called according to his purpose. You keep seeing this according to his purpose. And that purpose is that plan that he's had over the ages. For those whom he foreknew, there's that word foreordained again, right? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined, actually a different word. The foreknew is that he chose ahead of time. He also, you can see that down below. So that word is to know ahead of time, to choose ahead of time. For those he foreknew, he also predestined, to decide beforehand. He made a decision beforehand that these would be chosen to become conformed to the image of his son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. And each of these terms builds the one upon the others. Okay? And then we already saw Deuteronomy 4:37. Let's also look at Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. You are a holy people to Yahweh your Elohim. Yahweh your Elohim has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Yahweh did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because Yahweh loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers. Yahweh brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Okay, so this is a description of their chosenness and how he rescued them, right? He brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you. So notice the language about bringing them out with a mighty hand, redeeming them from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh. Because we're going to see that again in Ephesians. We're going to see the story of the Exodus played out. So the story of the Exodus that you're seeing played out is one of Israel's new Exodus. They're being taken out of Egypt, only this time, Egypt had nothing to do with their sins. Egypt had to do with the famine, and they went into Egypt, and then they stayed longer than they needed to, and Egypt imposed their will upon them. Now, we could also debate whether that was a roundabout way of exile because of their previous sins. We could debate that, but that's not the general reason of the Exodus. But the Exodus that's taking place now is an Exodus out of sin, right? It's a new Exodus, as I've described it. And it begins with the people that originally heard the message and were responsible to bring that witness to mankind. And it continues with the ones to whom they were to bring witness, so that everyone can be brought in the fullness of time. Deuteronomy 10:15. On your fathers did Yahweh set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. And then he tells them to circumcise their hearts. Then Deuteronomy 14, verse 2. For you are a holy people to Yahweh your Elohim, and Yahweh has chosen you to be a people of his possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And then let's go over to Psalm 89. Psalm 89, verse 20. And by the way, Psalm 89, the translators put in Yahweh's covenant with David and Israel's afflictions, is what they title that. It's interesting. Okay, verse 20. I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand will be established. My arm will also strengthen him. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. But I shall crush his adversaries before him. We've seen language like this already, right? In Isaiah. And strike those who hate him. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn will be exalted. I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. He will cry to me, you are my Father, my Elohim, and the rock of my salvation. I also shall make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall be confirmed to him. So I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. So this is the new David, right? This is the new David to come. Because the former David, right? First of all, he didn't fulfill everything either. We all know the circumstances behind David in his life, but we also know that David is dead and gone. And yet the new David is going to fulfill everything that you see written over here. Okay, he's referred to as his beloved one. David, my servant, with my holy oil have anointed him. Let's go over to Mark chapter 1, verse 9, which we went over in great detail. In those days, Yahshua came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Immediately coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opening and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And a voice came out of the heavens, you are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased. What is that? That's election, right? That's what we saw in Psalm 89. Election of the people, election of David, election of the ultimate David, who is his beloved Son, as Israel was considered his son. So you see the connections, right? This is Israel. This is the representative of Israel, the Son of Man, who is also the Son of Yahweh. He is his beloved Son. Whereas Israel was called son in a figurative way, he is called son in a very real way. I'm going to stop there because I have so much. I'm on page 2 of 4 pages of notes for chapter 1. So we have a lot to cover. So strap in, get comfortable, because we're going to be here a while.